First of all, I just want to thank you all for wonderful presentations. Thank you, Louise, for organizing this, and the rest of CHASM for organizing this, because it's been a tremendous gift to me to hear just a range of different perspectives concerning issues that, frankly, we're not discussing currently in the U.S. So I'll start with some broad comments about from the U.S. perspective, what do these issues mean? And then specifically point out some things that I found particularly compelling about each of the presentations. So first of all, I love the approach to this topic. It's nicely framed around the concept of economic risk shifting, which we know over the past 40 years under the economic regime in which we're living has meant shifting risk from institutions onto individuals. And as you all are discussing today, how that then intersects with energy policy. Again, not a topic we're currently discussing in the US. Very forward thinking to approach this and to specifically consider what's the financial pain that lower income households will disproportionately bear amidst net zero transitions. And from that perspective, I think it's really important to note, as Johnny just did, that we're already starting from a point of regressivity with respect to the proportion of income spent on energy among low-income households. And so there's this prospect of clean energy transitions further aggravating this regressivity. So the idea that, we have to first overcome the current regressivity we have to then, somehow transition to progressivity through transition. In the US, transportation is going to be a massive challenge for us. It's already a bit of a mess, and one of the reasons is that mass transit in the US is tremendously expensive to build. So there's been a real lag in public investments in public transit. It's going to be, to a certain degree, particularly because we're such a rural country, inevitable that we look at automobiles. The problem there, of course, is that in the private market, only higher income individuals are able to afford Teslas, and they're able to recoup a return on investment based on foregone petrol cost, thanks in part to plug-in energy at public access points. So they're literally pulling energy from public resources to fund their own gain. Anybody that drives a Tesla, thank you. So I'm just making a point around regressivity. And there's also a problem in the US around geospatial mismatch between work and residence, which is driven by a very inequitable housing market. And I'll mention in a moment other points of intersection with housing. It also occurred to me that risk, and I'm thinking of the comment that Sagar mentioned had earlier, that risk is multi-layered and geospatially distributed, and that we may be helping people, lower income people here in the UK or in the US, manage financial risk associated with transition. Yet if the sources of that new green energy is sourced with exploited labor in the global South, then we're simply transferring risk from north to south, which I think presents a pretty complex international policy challenge. So to go into some of the specific points, Carl, the concept of a poverty premium is a really compelling idea because it asserts that income redistribution via taxation in the social welfare state is not as efficient as we think, because we have to consider supply side arrangements, we have to consider the expense side of household income statements. And the issue of time poverty constraints and how much we can expect individuals, particularly lower income ones, to be involved as active market participants and make optimal decisions is problematic. And I think just, Carl, your organization, I have to say it's very notable that you all have a dual mission of advocacy and social investment. That's not something we see a whole lot of in US. And again, to go back to the poverty premium concept, I feel like what you articulated is further crystallized than what we discuss in the US. We tend to limit our discussion of that concept to high cost credit for the most part. Emma, I was really pleased to see a range of behavioral economic principles integrated into your work. We've done a series of field experiments over several years around tax refund saving, incorporating behavioral interventions. So a lot of that sounded very familiar and refreshing. I wonder if there may be an issue with which or to explore an issue around how individuals process information where they may be making active trade-offs between financial returns and social returns. So is there a way to potentially, at least hypothetically, model how an investment in Fund A would produce a return 2 percentage points lower than Fund B, yet the social return, however that's measured and articulated, at least hypothetically, could be 20 percentage points higher for Fund A. Does that sort of calculus kind of drive people's investment decisions? But in terms of scale, I wonder how much those types of messaging, how that could be applied to institutional investors. A running joke in the US is that Harvard University is a hedge fund with a university on the side. Is it possible that constituents of institutional investors can be reached to exert influence at larger scale? Particularly if you think about private universities, there's already a critical mass, presumably, of constituents that are concerned about climate. Luke, I love the exploration of this concept of fairness. It's such a, it's one of those concepts that we can easily take for granted. It's so central to devising solutions to transition, but it needs to be interrogated. How is fairness defined? What are the subordinate principles driving it? And to what degree do those principles vary by different levels of social and economic privilege? So having explored that in different communities and with different individuals, I think was really compelling. The other thing that really struck me is how important it is to be transparent about how change comes with costs. It seems to be this is an important starting point. If we're going to get to a point of fair distribution of risk, we have to start with the acknowledgement collectively that there are going to be costs borne by this transition. In the US, unfortunately, we have these two competing ideologies, one in which acknowledges the need for and cost of change, and not just with respect to climate change, but also structural racism. And then a competing ideology that absolutely denies the need for change, and hence any consideration of cost, whereas any talk of cost is a source of imposition on individual freedom. So, a little reference to our historic relationship between our countries and our displaced fascination with freedom amidst public issues and concerns. Johnny, I really appreciated the proactive perspective that hardship prevented is superior to hardship mitigated on the back end. The intersections with housing policy, your findings around insulation, the affordability of new housing that meets higher environmental standards in addition to remediation, the idea of home energy as a component of safe housing and how it is protective with respect to health outcomes. You think about the increased risk of heat stroke among the elderly in homes without air conditioning, other health issues impacted by colder heat, refrigerating medications like insulin for people with chronic health conditions, or powering assistive devices. Concept of the people's dividend is very compelling. It tracks really well with the concept of the freedom dividend that presidential candidate Andrew Yang popularized and has led to a lot of experimentation around basic income in the US. Just lastly, it was really notable how important it is to monitor the distributional data on cost and subsidies with respect to energy. And that kind of links back to my starting point about how we're starting from that point of regressivity. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, for your very, very insightful.